Right, so the case study opens up with this question that has carried you, Pastor Byron, for over two decades. So I'm curious about that. And the second question for you is, the Assemblies of God group has grown from strength to strength, but you're unsettled. What's going on?
So there's no icebreaker. The great thing about the surname Chicken is that is your icebreaker. So, I think my calling into ministry, I came into ministry really late, I think by some of the standards of those who have been pastors' kids and people who've grown up in ministry. I only really got a call to ministry in my 30s, and it was at a Hillsong conference in Sydney. It was a text on the screen from 1 Timothy 3:15. This is the church of the living God, which is the pillar and foundation of truth. And in that moment, it was almost audible. It was such a deep, clear impression out of nowhere that it felt really like Christ was tapping me on my right shoulder. And the question just that he posed was, what kind of church will you help me build? What kind of church will you help me build? And I had really no idea how to answer that. And that was the start of a 7-year navigation out of business into ministry. And I think the question has stayed with me, Maanda. That's why maybe I'm unsettled. Because I think as a group, we've been through a season, an extended season, which has been wonderful, continues to be wonderful. And I'll share some of it a little bit later this morning, about the strengthening of our local churches. And we came out of a history of smaller churches really needing to strengthen, really needing the leadership values to be heated up, really needing pastors to learn to become leaders, really learning to have to grow in leadership, and for the churches to become sustainable. And that period has been necessary, and it's been important, and it continues to be. So I don't want anybody to hear what I'm not saying this morning. But the thing that's unsettled me is I wondered whether we've lost a little bit of a sense of our entrepreneurialism. And I think the starting point of it was, for me, Thrive celebrated our 30-year birthday as a church. Pastor Steve and Kathy founded the church in 1994 at the dawn of our democracy, and we celebrated 30 years in 2024. And it was like God reminded me not only about Thrive, but several other churches that started in living rooms. And just to reflect on our story, I wasn't even there, but I've heard the stuff. Start in a living room, and then you move to a dodgy shopping center. And then the shopping center becomes 1 shop, 2 shops, 3 shops, 4 shops. And then Pastor Steve manages to get land and a park where people used to walk their dogs. What a useless activity. It becomes a church. Anyway, and then it's continued to grow and develop. And I just thought to myself, so many stories in our group started like that. And I felt God starting to stir my imagination around, I wonder if we could start a new season of entrepreneurialism, a new season of startup.
Oh, lovely. That's that is we can clap for that. And truly, that's the dilemma for the case. Whether or not the group, having grown to where we have grown, can we bring back that entrepreneurialism? So we'll unpack. But before we do that, we want to just honor the past. We want to just kind of go all the way back, over 100 years, Roseanne. Maybe you can just kind of outline in the case, just kind of walk us the journey of the beginnings of the Assemblies of God.
What's really fascinating is we took the opportunity, just when Maanda and I were chatting, just to rediscover some of the things that Peter Watt wrote about in his book, which trace the history of the Assemblies of God. And so often, as a church, just like you recently celebrated 30 years, we celebrated 50 years as a church this year. And we've seen God's faithfulness, and we've seen changes take place. We've seen what has been constant, and we have seen what he has prompted. And we always know that his mandate is bigger than us and bigger than what we can hope or imagine. But we are dissatisfied with where we are. And I think if we trace the history of the AOG, there have been so many tremendous things which God has done from the early years, and yet that we have this unfinished business, so to speak. And when we think of the life of Jesus, Jesus was here for 3 years. That's the period that he ministered. Yes, he was there 33 years, but 3 years he ministered. And he's passed that mandate on to us. And I think it's what we do with that history. There's so many threads from the AOG's history. From the early years, the Mullen brothers, Nicholas Bengu, and I don't know whether we're aware. And the danger is that as we move forward, we lose track of what God has actually done in the movement. And this morning we've sung about God's faithfulness, and I think we need to go back to some of those stories of his faithfulness and what he's done.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, absolutely. And we've outlined this. When the case is done, you'll get a beautiful summary of the history. Trev, just the recent history and the recent changes in leadership, especially the impact of Pastor Donovan and some of those latest activities, if you could perhaps recall those.
So it's interesting because everyone in this room knows that I'm an outsider. So that's it. So the interesting thing is the institutional memory is very shallow. So, and I don't mean that with disrespect to anything. Being part of a different church that was, in my very early days, part of my Christian walk in the early days, left the AOG, and then for many years I grew up as a leader being developed in an independent church. So coming back into the group was very refreshing for me, because you get to see what other people may have just taken for granted, and in that journey, it's interesting because I was never a part of the group really under Brother Bond's leadership. So all I can draw memory to is what I've been told through the generations. Some of that's very positive, and some of it might be less so. But there's an incredible journey that Brother Bond put together and shaped the early stages of what we know the group to be today. Pastor Donovan did something very unique. He took what was a wonderful foundation and built upon it a different relational equity, if you like. Pastor Donovan, we all know this, amongst the most relational human beings on the planet. If he wasn't crying, he was shouting. But there was very little in between. And he took what had become an institutionalized, structured, very specific, singularly led organization to a more modern approach, giving freedom to autonomous leadership and creating room for people to express themselves within their levels of gifting. And that changed the dynamic of what the group became. He removed the idea that ministers needed to move around every 3 years. For example, something as small as that, which is small in principle but enormous in effect. We all know that you can never establish anything in 3 years. So it was those kinds of things that he opened up. And he gave room for people. And I think I'm an example of that. He believed in Nix and me when he really didn't need to. And he believed in all of us in this room. And he would have died for all of us. And his deep passion for the leaders thriving overwhelmed pretty much every other factor of his leadership context. He desperately loved us. And that gives every one of us as ministers an incredible ability and a confidence to believe that if he believes in us and God believes in us, we can do it. And that is an incredible space of leadership.
Lovely. Yes, absolutely.
Maanda, can I just add a thought there? You know, when Donovan worked the relationship, because really our group is simply a culmination, a collection of churches with a voluntary submission to like an apostolic oversight. And there's nothing holding our group together legally other than the togetherness that we desire. But what I found so fascinating about the case study is how that was a rediscovery of what Nicholas Bengu and others had insisted upon, is that we do not become a denomination of structure and hierarchy and rigidity, and we lose our Pentecostalism, and we lose our relationalism, and we lose our sense of leadership gifting, operating in the local church, you know. And I didn't actually realize until I saw your case study just how much Donovan had mined from the past to actually make that happen. He resisted, and we have resisted and continue to resist becoming a monolithic type structure. We want local autonomy.
Yeah, and it's unique for some of us who study organizations that a movement this big with such history can be held together by something so intangible. And it's something we want to carry forward. It's something that's easy to lose, but yet it's so powerful and profound. All right, I'm a business school guy. How's money managed here?
So money for the churches comes from tithes and offerings. That money is overseen by boards and elders. Some have a board of directors, some have a board of elders, some have both. And key decisions are made around that. And there would be mandates in place for capital expenditure limits. Well, pastors that are doing their job properly, at least, would have mandates and limits, etc. And the lead pastors are accountable to that structure for how the money is used. Yeah.
Lovely. I love the quote by Tony Dellas. I think he says, you know, this is God's money. We have to be super accountable on how we manage our finances. I spoke to Pastor Johan, and he said, you know, you walk into any Assemblies of God group church, and you know you have walked into one. There's just something about it. Roseanne, what is it about? What happens? How's the service structures like?
I think that's one of the legacies of Pastor Donovan. He got very practical in talking about how we run a service. I remember the early 1970s and sitting in round circles, and anybody can say anything and do anything. And some of the positivity of our view of priesthood of believers, but also some of the nonsense that came with that, and just seeing the thread that we see within the group, dynamic worship, a love for God's word, for sound preaching, the use of scripture, for hospitality. That was another thing that Pastor Donovan was big on, and just practical things like getting rid of hygiene factors, things that can distract us from focusing on the main thing, honoring God, serving people. And I think that is sort of part of the DNA of the group, and it's something that in all of our churches we do see.
Excellent. And we want to codify that even for generations to come, to sort of carry that DNA going forward. In this growing from strength to strength, Roseanne, culture has been a big lever. And you talk about this work at Edge of driving this culture. Do you want to just unpack this culture as a key lever to growth?
We saw a leadership transition at Edge Church in 2020, and we did it in the midst of COVID, which is really not just challenging, but also did give a period of grace because there was less of an interface with the congregation at that time. One of the things that we discovered is that while we were reformulating God's call on our house and re-envisioning mission, vision, where we headed, one of the things that was clear to us is that while we might have had abstract statements of our values that remained either conceptual or in some places even weaponized, we came to the place that we realized that we needed to not just have a sense of our aspirational culture, but we needed to be clear, find words, articulate, and describe specific behaviors that would emulate that culture. And then also speak very clearly about what we would not tolerate and what we did not want to see. We had a smaller team of folk that we spent a good 8 months of processing. We met approximately once a month, and it was a sort of quite a mixed group of people, not just staff. And just as we became clearer, we saw that there were practices that we needed in place in the church. So we, in every sense, from taking things, preaching them through Sunday services, through working through our culture as a ministry team, to taking even things like we have a welcome dinner once a month. And one of the things new people is they are a great read of what your culture is actually like. And we give new people the permission to say, where have you seen the culture in operation at the church? And it might not have been your experience, so talk back to us and let us know where you haven't seen this culture in operation. And so that has been tremendously insightful for us. And it's not just, okay, we did that just in the early years of our transition, but that has been, and it still is today, something which we are constantly embedding in the life of the church.
And I love, we've got it in the case, one of the incidences that you observed of a racial discrimination in the service and how you dealt with that head on to uphold that value, that it's no longer just on paper, but when you see something that you don't stand for, that gets addressed head on. So thank you for that. So I want to come back. You were unsettled that we've grown from strength to strength, but we may have lost this church planting muscle. Church planting is, I haven't planted one, but from what I hear, it's hard. Can we really go out here and just go plant churches? What could get in the way?
Where to start? Yeah, I think there's a tension, Maanda, and I maybe want to just surface that as soon as possible because I think the balance is critical here. I think the issue for us as a group to balance and the tension to hold is a mindset, an openness, a propensity to bring into our long-term planning, a seeking of God and asking God, to have it on our radar, to make it a stated mission and objective and desire and plan for our church to multiply. That's what I'm saying needs to find its way back into our mindsets and into our mix. Not simply the focus on getting stronger, but for us to have the deep desire to want to see a new community launched. And you do need a strong house in order to plant. And you are going to suffer if you don't have that. And it's not wise, and people can get hurt, and leaders can get fried. and permanently exit ministry if it's not done well. So that's the tension that I want us to just hold, is on the one hand, to be seeking God, asking God, taking some risks, rediscovering an entrepreneurial spirit when it comes to the multiplication of our churches. At the same time, being wise about when, where, how. And I'm not talking about being conservative. I'm talking about being wise. You know what I'm saying? Because I think we can be lulled into a conservatism to be safe. And it is the natural, and the natural state of affairs is to atrophy. So every church that matures will naturally atrophy unless it's got sparks of reinvention and it's got sparks of rediscovery. You with me? You said 50 years, 30, you have to fight to be young as a church. And one of the things that planting does is it makes you young again. Trev's 2 weeks into a plant at Bridge North. And next year, and his face has just got younger. It does, it keeps you young. So I don't want to say, garden plant. That's a silly, that's not a good leadership call. But to begin to think, plan, pray, ask God, bring it onto the radar. Talk, let it start to become part of the fabric and the culture of the church. That's what I'm talking about, Maanda.
Sure, right. And big part of that is to develop leaders that can also lead these church plants. Talk to us about the new initiative on leadership development.
Yeah, Lead Academy. So I'll talk about it in a lot more detail in my session a little bit later. But let me say this. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that the future of our group depends on the leaders that we raise. And the church planting is never going to be a reality unless you've got the people to do it. And so grassroots development becomes, in my view, the most sustainable and best long-term strategy. In other words, we take leaders that have the call of God on their lives, that have a deep desire to become more highly skilled and more deeply formed. We do not want skilled leaders who are not becoming more like Christ, because then we just get more train wrecks. So you don't need high-capacity leaders leading churches. You need high-capacity, Christ-centered church leaders leading churches. You know what I'm saying? And so what we've decided is to launch Lead Academy next year. I'll talk more about it. It launches in March 27 next year with the desire to grow more leaders. Yeah.
Excellent. So could you help me thank my panel? I will take the next 15 minutes to sort of round up some of the learnings. Do you want to give a round of applause to Pastor Byron, Roseanne, and Trev? So that was just a taste of the case study that we are building, we are finalizing. Students the world over will learn from your journey and your stories. If maybe you can load up my slides. And there's quite a lot we get to see from a leadership perspective. And the first piece we see from just the longevity of the organization is that there were things that were stable. There were practices, the way the church manages finances, the way relationships are key, and a number of elements that we highlight in the case study. But this conversation also carries this part around change. Organizations that do well in the future, they get to have to manage stability and change. And it's this tension and that we carry as leaders every single day. And in the, if you show the next slide, there's a great book by Andy Crouch who talks about institutions. If we are thinking about tomorrow, perhaps we may want to think generations. And this is what the Assemblies of God has already demonstrated to run and navigate through apartheid, through so many ups and downs, through leaders that came and left, etc., and we are over a century old. That requires the four elements of a healthy institution. One, the roles must be clear, the rules must be clear, the arenas, the artifacts, and these must be carried forward by records and rituals. And in the case study, if we had more time, you will have seen how this group has got different roles of different leaders, what the governance structures looks like, how we are loosely governed, and that's a rule in itself. And the arenas where we come, we engage, we build relationships, etc. So that's one part, which is some things must stay stable for us to lead for generations. However, some things must change. And if I was teaching the case in class, I was going to ask my class to say, what must happen now? How should Byron lead this organization into the future for this organization to go back to church planting again? If we can go to the next slide. These are some of the elements that you'll get from the case. But the next slide is where I want to land just briefly. Now, here is what we know about leading change. One of the models that we have found to work, we call it the influence model. And it simply says, I will change my mindset, my behavior into this new tomorrow picture and imagination. First, if I understand and I'm convinced of the change. If I understand and I'm convicted of the change. Number two, if there are reinforcing mechanisms, the structures, the systems, the incentives, all these elements within my space that reinforce the new change. Number three, if I'm competent and I have the tools to can lead or move in the direction that you're leading us. And number four, if I see my leaders and my peers behave in the new way. So I must understand and be convinced. I must see different reinforcing mechanisms. I must have the competency to do what you're asking me to do. And I must see my peers and my leaders behave in that new way. And in the case, if we can go to the next page, in the case, you'll see a bunch of elements from, we didn't touch on all of them. But for instance, the Lead Academy, it's an incredible tool to say these people must be competent to go lead in this new way. Now, the question is this. If we are going to lead pastors, it's not enough to just cast vision. Because we can say we want to go there, and then we have a vision service. That just ticks at a half, maybe, the first block of people understand and are convinced. So if we are going to lead and move towards multiplication, the people must understand and be convinced. So there's a difference. Right? It's not, I must preach or I must cast vision. The people must fully understand and the people must be convinced, which means the scorecard tends to the other way. Can you say hand in heart that your team fully understands and is convinced? Yes, you may have spoken about it, but do they understand and are they convicted? Because that's a whole new different metric. Over and above that, what else is in place? What else is in place? Do we have reinforcing mechanisms? What processes have we set in place? What structures exist? What incentive models what else have we set in place to enable the change? Have we trained people sufficiently? And the question on training, it's not have we done a session? It's are people competent? So it reverses. So you can tick the box and say, yes, we have done this session and that session and that session. But the real question is, are they competent? The last thing is, what are we setting in place to ensure that there's role modeling? I want to go to the next slide of the same, and I want to ask a question. So I did say I'm a lecturer, so you're allowed to participate. So of these 4 elements, understanding and conviction, kind of getting buy-in, having reinforcing mechanisms, building competency and tools, and role modeling. They did further research to find out which one has the biggest impact in leading change. This is where I want to invite your voting now. Those that say, fostering understanding and conviction and getting the buy-in of people, that's got the highest impact in change. Maybe you can show by raising your hand. Those that say, if people, you do know how to raise your hand. Okay. Okay. So those that say, if we can foster understanding and conviction, that's got the biggest impact in driving change. 1, 2, wow, just few of us, right. Okay, let me see. Those that say having reinforcing mechanisms and structures and systems and incentives and platforms and AI tools and all of that. I must just tell you, one of the leaders in IBM, she wanted to bring in design thinking in that organization. She spends billions kind of even restructuring how people set. So to reinforce this new thinking. Now, those that say this second one has the biggest impact, a show by raise a hand, just a few. This is going to be hard. Those that say developing talent and skills, developing leaders and all of that. Right, okay. These are my friends. Those that say, when I see my leaders and peers behave differently. Okay, the class passed with flying colors. The biggest change comes from role modeling. And the question is, when we leave here fired up, what are we going to role model? We talk about the future and technology and AI. How are you as a leader role modeling, embracing AI? We talk about all these things of reaching out and building a diverse leadership team. Who are your friends as a leader? We talk of all these elements. We can preach it. We can train people. But if it's not embodied in us, the change doesn't go far. How might we role model this art of multiplication? What will I personally leave from here and just go do differently? At a personal level, as we lead ourselves for the next slide, I went, so these are some of the elements here that we pick up in the case, that perhaps as we lead and strengthen our multiplication muscle, these are some of the things that, from what I've had in conversations, that perhaps we need to move towards. And how might we use sort of that influence model and populate all those areas to lead any of those that you might be accountable to? So as we bring this towards the conclusion, we have a role to play in leading change. And personally, for us as we lead ourselves, when we leave out of here, it will be incredibly important to be super clear on one or two of those things that God is nudging us to change. It will be incredibly important to set a few things in place, to say, I now wake up at this time. I now go to this midweek service. I now do the following things in line with the change I want to see in myself. These are one or two other modules I want to start to learn and grow. And here is how I'm going to surround myself with different people so I can learn from them, so that I can see others behave in the new way. So the question for us today is, what's that leadership influence, model, plan for you going to look like? That's on the change part. On the stability part, what has been the things that have worked for you? When leadership rises or stagnates or decline, to a large extent, it's a function of drifting. So some of those spiritual disciplines that you used to have, are they still in play? Some of the sort of the prayer time that you used to observe, the exercise regime as a person, the accountability meetings that you used to have with your mentors, what are those elements that needs to stay stable that has worked over the years? And that's what led me as I went back to the village, growing up there, incredible poor conditions, and by God's grace and all of that, managed to kind of lead to where we are today. What going home over the weekend did for me was just to remind me, what are those elements that actually still have to be revived to stay in place? As you lead your teams, would you be super clear on what needs to change? The new reinforcing mechanisms. How should the team and what should they learn? And how might they be role modeling in the team? At the slide, there's a project. Have you heard of Project Aristotle? So at Google, they decided to figure out what actually makes a great team at Google. They studied everything the world over. They crunched a ton of data, and they came up with these 5 elements. Dependability. So what makes a great team at Google is that there's this sense of dependability. I can count on my peers to do great work. That's one. Number 2, there is structure and clarity in how we work together as a team. Number 3, there is psychological safety. I can take interpersonal risk amongst my team members. Number 4, the meaning of work. What I'm working on, I feel it's meaningful to me. Number 5, the impact of work. I believe that the work I'm doing has impact beyond me. Yeah, those were the 5 elements. Further research dug the numbers some more. Then they found that there was one of these 5 had the biggest impact on team effectiveness. Voting time again. Those that say dependability, I can count on my team members to do good work. Show of hands. You do remember. Those that say if there's good structure and clarity of roles and who's doing what, where, and how, if that's in place, that's the most important piece. May I remind you, I wrote a book called Lead with Super Clarity. So please be nice to me. So let me repeat that one. Those that say structure and clarity, it's most important. Good, thank you for some sympathy hands. Number 3, those that say psychological safety. There is I can take interpersonal risk. Right. Number 4, those that say meaning of work. What I'm working on is super meaningful to me. Interesting. I should have guessed. Those that say impact of work. We do work that matters here. I actually should have guessed this one too. Unfortunately, the majority. Sorry? That's a good question. That's a good question. But unfortunately, majority didn't win this time. They found that psychological safety had the biggest impact on team effectiveness. The fact that I can take interpersonal risk with my peers. That I can admit a mistake. That I can challenge and put my opinion forward. And I have been in church spaces for most of my life. I was going to say for a long time, and I realized maybe I don't look like a long-time guy. Psychological safety. Sorry, the H must go. Psychological safety. Psychological safety. Will you change your voting? Psychological safety. I've been around organizations faith-based, hardcore, capitalist kind of environments, it's sad to say I found church environments can be brutal. And you find this toxic culture in church that just confuse you. Where if we were to measure psychological safety, we'll be at its lowest. And as we go and role model, as we lead teams, may we lead and bring the space where it's psychologically safe to do work at church. I'll meet an amazing leader and I just say, you're so amazing. And then I meet the person who works for them and I go, what happened here? And truly what this requires is for us as leaders to set the stage, to sort of say, hey, we want to do this. I think that we will make some mistake and it's okay. We'll experiment. Number 2 is to invite participation. I know we are spirit-led and we are convinced of where we're going, but may we lead with just inviting others in and get more ideas and welcome all views, even though they're opposing to yours. And the third, which is the most important, when someone makes a mistake, how do we as leaders respond? How you respond determines everything. Whether or not people will feel safe again to contribute. My last slide. I wonder if Peter worked under your leadership. He will just rebuke you. What it says to me is that Jesus role modeled and led and created a psychologically safe environment. May we, as we lead towards tomorrow, hold, protect, preserve those things that must stay and be stable. May we lead change by being super clear on what must change. Reinforce elements. It's not enough to just sort of saying, I've told you so. Build leadership capability through all manners and ways. And lastly, be role models and role model leading like Jesus. Thank you.